Greetings people, Des King at kskdesign.com.au, and once again I apologise for the long period between videos. Again, I've been caught up with a few things, plus I've started work on my new book, Shoji and Kumiko Design Book 3. Book 3 will cover advanced Kumiko patterns, and at this stage I think there should be around about 40 or so new patterns included in the book. These are just some of the patterns that I've made so far. All going well, and with hopefully few disasters, the book should be finished around about this time next year. Now with Christmas just a few months away, I thought I'd put the shoji to one side and in this video show you how to make up the asa-no-ha pattern. And for this, I thought we'd make up an asa-no-ha coaster. Now the asa-no-ha is probably the main pattern that people associate with Kumiko work. It's not a particularly difficult pattern to make, and it's probably the first pattern that people tackle when they begin making Kumiko. There are basically 4 different ways of making the square asa-no-ha pattern, and these are covered in detail in Book 1, The Basics. The only difference between the 4 is the joinery for the individual pattern pieces. Other than that, they all look exactly the same. The way I'll show you today is my preferred method, which is the Genkotsu Type 1. So without further ado, let's get on to the pattern. The things you need for the coaster are first and foremost Kumiko. For this coaster I've set the mitsuge. If you remember, that's the part of the Kumiko that you see when you look directly from the front. The mitsuge is 3.2 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch, and the mikomi is 10 millimeters. And you'll need to make up a few of those. Next you'll need a few jigs. First, a 67.5 degree jig. Now again, these jigs are covered in detail in the book with proper dimensions and all the necessary angles. So I'll just roughly cover what they are. When I say 67.5 degrees, 67.5 is the angle that it shaves the end of the Kumiko. And I'll just show you exactly what that 67.5 means. That tape, the top of the tape, is basically the base that the Kumiko rests on. Okay, 67.5 degrees is that angle there. I hope you can see that. That's 67.5 degrees. You'll also need a 45 degree jig, 45 being that angle there, and also a 22.5 degree jig, 22.5 or 22.5 being that angle there. You'll also need a 90 degree Kumiko cutting jig. This is described in detail in Book 1, and we use this to cut the joints, the half-lap joints in the Kumiko. Now with the coaster you'll notice that there are 6 jigumi Kumiko, jigumi being the base Kumiko. You've got the 3 vertical and 3 horizontal. You've got 4 diagonal Kumiko coming out from the center. On each side of each of those diagonal Kumiko you have 2 hinge pieces, and connecting each of those hinge pieces and securing each of those hinge pieces are small locking pieces. Now I've given the coaster a pitch of 44 millimeters. Now if you remember what a pitch is, the pitch is from the left hand side of the Kumiko to the left hand side of the adjacent Kumiko. The key thing with the asa-no-ha and all square patterns is that this obviously has to be a square, and these 4 squares that make up the overall asa-no-ha obviously have to be a perfect square. Now the key point with the coaster measurements is not necessarily the 44 millimeter pitch, although you want to make that as close as you can to get a coaster this size. But the important thing is that each of those 4 squares that go up to make the coaster are exactly the same. So the pitch is exactly the same for each of those 4 squares. So the easiest way of doing that is just taking a scrap piece of Kumiko, placing a mark on the left, and then measuring across 44 millimeters, and placing another mark. Once you've marked those in, just take a square and extend the mark all the way across. Once you've done that, take one of the Kumiko that you'll be using, we'll call it Master Kumiko, and secure it to the scrap piece that you just marked. Okay, allow yourself enough on the end to make up these small extensions. I've made these 6 millimeters. Once you've secured it, mark the first, then the second, then move it across, move your scrap Kumiko across so that the first mark that you made on the scrap piece now lines up perfectly with the second mark that you made on your Master Kumiko, and secure that. And place that mark. Those 3 marks now have exactly the same pitch. Next, secure 6 Kumiko in your Kumiko cutting jig. You can use clamps to secure them against the side fence. I just use an old Kumiko and screw that in, and that holds it up against the fence nice and securely. Once the Kumiko are nice and secure, extend the marks that you made on the Master Kumiko across all the other Kumiko. If you prefer to have a better registration for the saw when starting off your cut, what you can do is just, once you've made your mark, just cut at a slight angle, just to give you a bit of a groove, and that gives a better registration for the saw when you make your initial cut. So continue that for all 3 joints. Now, if you remember, we said that the Mikomi is 10 millimeters, so the joints have to be cut down to a minimum of 5 millimeters, or preferably about 5.5 millimeters. When cutting the half lap joints, it's important that they're cut at exactly 90 degrees. So if you like, you can just add a mark or add a line to cut with a pencil. And just cut down on that line. Now with a nice sharp saw blade, just begin cutting those joints and cut them down to about 5.5 millimeters. Once you've made the first cut, flip the jig around and mark and cut the other side of the joints exactly the same way as we did in the exercises. Place your marking Kumiko down until you no longer see the curve, and then just mark across. Again, move it across until you no longer see the curve. And then mark it across. And cut down 5.5 millimetres. When you've made both cuts, just take a 3mm chisel and remove the waste. Just be careful when you're doing it, but that should come out fairly easily. There you go, that should come out fairly easily. Now, before you remove the Kumiko from the jig, what you need to do is to place a mark just past the first joint. Mark across with a pencil all of the Kumiko. That indicates either the left-hand side or the bottom. Once you've done that, mark 6 millimetres from the outside of the first and third joint and mark across. Probably just so you don't get confused, just make a double mark on the one that indicates the top and the left hand side. Okay, that mark is the end of the extension there. That mark is the end of the extension, and this end mark is the end of that extension. Once you've removed your Kumiko from the cutting jig, cut off the ends and don't forget to chamfer the ends on all sides. A good way to check that the pitch is exactly the same is to take 2 Kumiko, turn one round the other way so that the mark is on opposite sides, and then line up the joints. And if the joints line up perfectly, then that pitch is exactly the same. Okay, we're now ready to put the jigumi together. Now for gluing, remember I said we made the marks. So these marks for these three indicate that this is the left-hand side, and these marks indicate that these three, this is the bottom. So this is the orientation for those 6 kumiko. For the glue, I just use normal PVA, Aquadear, just normal white glue. The weakest part of this, the coasters, are the extensions, because that is the weakest part, and if anything's going to break, it's going to be that extension, that 6mm extension. So just give it a little bit of extra glue to make it a bit more secure. Okay, make sure the orientation is correct. The mark is on the left-hand side. Then start applying the vertical kumiko again, just giving a little bit of extra glue to the extensions. We've already put glue in the middle, so there's no need to glue that. Again, making sure that the mark is down the bottom, so you have the correct orientation, and just gently feed the kumiko in. Now they should slide in, if your cutting has been okay, they should slide in without too many hassles. If one's a little bit tight, don't push it in with your fingers, because that will guarantee to snap the kumiko. What you need to do is to make yourself a hardwood hitting block, and if a kumiko needs a little bit of encouragement to go in its joint, just place the block on and gently tap, and that applies pressure or tension to the whole kumiko, and so you're reducing the risk of snapping. If you try and push it in with your fingers, you're putting too much pressure on one particular place, and invariably the kumiko will snap. Okay, so just keep applying the glue, making sure that you have the correct orientation. And the last one. Again, orientation correct. Feed that in. And we've now completed the jigumi for the asa-no-ha pattern. The next pieces we put in are the 4 diagonal pieces, and they are 57.7mm. So they'll be trimmed to size on the 45-degree jig. So the 57.7mm, according to the CAD diagram, is merely a very accurate guide. So what we need to do now is to cut 4 pieces around about 59mm. Next is to trim the diagonal pieces to fit, and this is done on the 45-degree jig. Just trim the ends, making sure that the point is in the centre of the piece. Just trim both ends. Just trim them until you get a nice firm fit. And at this stage there's no need to apply any glue. to the diagonals. So that's one diagonal done. Just continue and fit the other three. And with the last diagonal, just like all the others, just trim it to fit. Just keep trimming until it slides in. Now we have the 4 diagonals, and that's the first part of the asa-no-ha done. The next pieces we have to cut and fit are the hinge pieces. This forms a 45-degree angle. So this end is cut on a 22.5-degree jig. And where the hinges join and form a housing for the locking piece, this is cut on a 67.5-degree jig. It's not cut in the middle, it's cut to a ratio of around about 1/3 to 2/3. The 1/3 is where the hinge joins, and the 2/3 is where it opens up to form a housing for the locking piece. So the most efficient way of doing this is to cut all of the, or to trim all of the pieces on the 67.5 to get the 1/3, 2/3 ratio squared away, and then put the 67.5 jig away and then work on the 22.5-degree jig. That's the most efficient way of doing it. So I hope you can see that. We've got the 1/3 here and the 2/3 on the top there. That will join with the other hinge, and that opens up with the other hinge to house the locking piece. Now just start trimming the other end on the 22.5-degree jig. You can use a pair of calipers just to get an idea of how close you are. That's 30.7, so it's still a fair way to go. Okay, getting fairly close there, so I'll just try that. So when you're getting reasonably close to it, to the measurements, just try, give it a test fit. And you can see, possibly see by that, that's still a little bit too long. And that's getting close, probably just one more shaving. And you can see there that hopefully you can see, that joint there, the 45-degree angle in there, that now fits nice and snug. And the hinge pieces come together quite nicely, and with a little bit of tension from the locking piece, that'll hold that together quite nicely. One very handy piece of kit to have when making the more detailed Kumiko patterns is this, a pair of tweezers or pincers, and they make handling the Kumiko much easier. Try and get my hands out the way. It's so much easier to handle the Kumiko with the pincers. Once the last of the hinge pieces have been trimmed and inserted, it's then time to start on the locking pieces. And that's when the pattern all starts to come together. Okay, we've got 8 locking pieces, and they're trimmed on both ends on the 45-degree jig. The length of the locking pieces, according to the diagram, is 16.5 millimetres, but again, that's merely a guide, and we'll trim them so that they fit nice and firmly. These locking pieces get fairly small, so when trimming them, just be a little bit careful. Make sure you don't start trimming your fingernail as well. Once it fits, just apply glue. And push it into place. And it's now time to fit the last locking piece. And complete the pattern. And there you have it. There's our completed asa-no-ha pattern. Once the glue thoroughly dries, you can then just get some sandpaper, 240 grit, 360, 400 grit, and just lightly sand over the top to clear off all the glue marks, all of the pencil marks on the top, and flip it over and do the back as well. Again, just be careful of these extensions. They're the weakest part of the whole lot. But other than that, that's nice and firm. That won't fall apart at all. And that's our asa-no-ha pattern. Well, that's our coaster and our asa-no-ha pattern. It is a beautiful pattern, and as I said, it's not particularly difficult to make, but it does lend itself to a vast range of applications. Well, I hope you found it interesting. These coasters really are very handy, and they do make wonderful gifts with very much a personalised touch. If you'd like to see other examples of the asa-no-ha and numerous other patterns that I've made, please visit my website at kskdesign.com.au. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.